Thank you for joining us this evening for this documentary film, Blood Brothers, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. I must apologize first off. I meant to mention in the introduction before we started the film that if you had any questions or comments, please place those in the Q&A or the chat, and our discussant this evening will address your questions or comments. So first, let me introduce the great Herb Boyd, who you saw in the film, and is the reason he is here with us this evening. Herb Boyd is an award-winning journalist and author who teaches African-American history at the City College of New York, or CUNY. His most recent book is Harlem Renaissance Redo. In 2017, he published Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination. Among his other books are The Diary of Malcolm X, co-edited with Malcolm's daughter, Ilyasa Shabazz, and By Any Means Necessary, Malcolm X, Real, Not Reinvented, co-edited with Dr. Haki Madhubuti, Dr. Ron Daniels, and Dr. Maulana Karinga. So please welcome our friend, Herb Boyd.
Well, thank you, Samuel. And as expected from you, a very gracious introduction. And I certainly welcome this opportunity to be with you at the Heinz Center there in Pittsburgh, which I've visited on several occasions. And I think this is the first time I've done it virtually.
Yes.
But it's no less stimulating, no less informative. Let me say that from the very top, Sam, that Blood Brothers goes back to the book that Johnny Smith and Randy Roberts pulled together. This is a tremendous study. And I think Marcus Clarke and Alex Wright and the whole crew there, they did a marvelous job of capturing the essence of what Randy and Johnny conveyed. It was good to have them on camera there too, so they could expand on, elaborate on some of the stuff that they wrote about, because it's pretty exhaustive what they did there. I always think of, you see these things and you reflect on it again and say, well, I wish I had said this, but it's done, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. Sometimes, you see these documentaries and they interview you and you say, oh my goodness, what did I say that for? What did I really meant this, but I feel real good about this one, talking about two of my heroes, Malcolm and Muhammad, and the kind of bromance, as one writer put it, these two blood brothers coming together, something that Malcolm, I don't know if I think Randy may have mentioned that, or Johnny may have mentioned it in the book, in terms of where that particular expression, the whole Blood Brothers title, but Malcolm had said that himself back in 1964 in an article in Liberator magazine, the outstanding publication of a previous generation, with Daniel Watts, was the editor publisher there. And Malcolm had said something like, we're all blood brothers. And so he connected in a very general way, something that very specifically Randy and Johnny has done, and that Marcus and crew have brought it to us. This is, I think, the second time I really had a chance to look at it all the way through, but I've seen bits and pieces of it. I read the reviews, and most of the reviews have been very, very commendable. It's just outstanding work that Marcus and his crew has done. I think we got a few participants here, huh, Sam? So maybe we can go ahead with the time allocated that we can begin to have a discussion, particularly based on some of their impressions and some of their questions, okay? Unmute yourself there, Sam. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
Want to remind our audience to please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'm monitoring those, so as soon as we get questions in there, I'll pose them to her. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a few of my own questions. Can we pull together the issues? I think in the film, it kind of portrayed it at the time that they were both traveling separately in Africa, in which the overriding sort of context, the way the film was portraying it, was that these were two different attempts to address the issues facing Black people, no longer the issues in the United States, but the issues in the African diaspora. And can you speak a little bit about that? Because the music connected to that was Redemption Song.
Oh, yes.
And so you're bringing everything from Garvey to that present time with those men in Africa, and the people they were meeting with, and what did that mean to Black America? What did that mean to the African diaspora?
Very good question. You know, earlier, Sam, you had pointed out your connection to Bob Marley's birthday, and of course with Muhammad Ali's birthday as well. You know, in your own family and everything. So you have that correlation, and I'm sure you kind of feel very uplifted by that. You know, that connection. I always feel that that's important because we can ground ourselves in such a way we can personalize these things, and it becomes far more substantial, so much more intimate, that you can grab onto that history that we were a part of, that continue to be a part of this continuum that we have. Your question, though, is a good one in the sense that, and one we grapple, Ilyasa and I grapple with when we put together his travel diary, which needs to be further explored. It just offers so many very, very pressing issues. One that I wish they had touched on a little bit more in the documentary in terms of the surveillance of the FBI and the CIA. That's something that I've been working on for several years now. And it's so extensive beyond Malcolm, but a number of African Americans all the way back, you know, to Hubert Harris, and that Jeff Perry has done such a wonderful job exploring his life, through Paul Robeson, all of the Cold War period, the Smith Act, and the number of activists in this country who were just absolutely terrified, to say nothing of COINTELPRO. But what happens with both of them traveling at that time in Africa, 1964, as the winds of change blowing across the continent, the whole anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles that are going on. And here you have these two iconic individuals, you know, with separate kind of urgencies and impulses that are taking them to the continent. Of course, Malcolm had been there before in 1959 and kind of took a step back from it because he didn't want to like upstage Elijah Muhammad at that time, who had not visited, certainly going to Mecca. So he held off doing that until 1964. One of the things that that's kind of touched on there and needs further elaboration is that I think at the end of the documentary, you have Hannah and you have Ilyasa talking about those last opportunities the two of them had to come together. And we talk about that in the diary, where some people say it's the airport, some people say it's at the hotel, outside the Ambassador Hotel, wherever it was. The regret that Muhammad Ali expressed later on in Soul of a Butterfly that Hannah talked about is that he regretted that he turned his back on Malcolm at that time and refused to have a discussion with him. But as Ilyasa pointed out, some very complicated situations going on at that time, and these forces that interfered and disrupted the possibility of them going on in their lives and having a very vital connection in terms of the struggle. Because the two of them, as we used to talk about Dr. King and Malcolm being together, how powerful that tandem would have been as we struggle for human and civil rights in this country and globally too, because Malcolm, in going to Africa, it was a global impact that he had representing Black America. It was just simply amazing that he's meeting with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and all of the African expatriates that are living, African American expatriates that are living there in Ghana at that time is simply amazing. I mean, Julian Mayfield and Maya Maki, and becomes Maya Angelou later, to say nothing of Shirley Graham Du Bois and W.B. Du Bois. I mean, the list is long and deep of these influential African Americans who had congregated there in Accra, Ghana, and later on would shift to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and continue on that same kind of influence and giving the African American expression a different kind of characterization, one that far apart from even the impressions that African Americans had of Africa, and Muhammad Ali was very good about that, and Malcolm too in his speeches, that we had like a terrible understanding because of the false misinformation that had been given to us about the African experience and what we had seen in magazines and seen in the films, and those depictions were just terribly inaccurate, horrible, almost brutal depictions of the African continent. So I think that both Muhammad and Malcolm, was trying to say, look here, we need to connect up these disparate individuals. We need to bring them together, and they need a better understanding. Africans need to have a better understanding what's happening to African Americans, and African Americans certainly need to kind of dig a little deeper into that African experience, because Malcolm told him, say, you talk about you haven't lost anything in Africa. Well, you lost your mind, you lost your soul. So that's a pretty good beginning, I think, Sam, in terms of talking about those two individuals and the missions they were on and going to the continent.
So we have a number of questions.
Sure.
The first one from Keish says, now that information is out that it was FBI doing, have the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X's families reconciled?
This a little bit, of course, the daughters have been, you saw Attila speaking at the memorial services, funeral services for Muhammad Ali. And I think the general impression that she conveyed at that time, that obviously the olive branch, the compassion, the love, the closing comments coming from Ilyasa in asking Muhammad Ali how he felt, and that he just loved Malcolm. And I think that's the healing, part of the healing process that comes in, the division and the necessity of us kind of putting aside a lot of the animosity, a lot of the difficulties we had, a lot of that was propagated, by forces outside. We know with the whole COINTELPRO, for example, put out a lot of misinformation and turned us against one another. And certainly, I mean, I've gone back and forth with the CIA seeking all kinds of documents. They have revealed a good portion of it is still concealed, and what they do send out to you is so redacted. I mean, you get a black page, Sam. So, well, come on, man, give it up. Let us understand exactly what was going on during that period of time. So it's a lot more information we're going to have to pull together. And I think that too will be part of the healing process, because they begin to see how they were manipulated, how they were misinformed, how they were turned against each other. and of course, that was a part of the process, that kind of divide and conquer that's always been a part of the more divisive and reactionary forces of the American experience. I always call it, Sam, the USA, the United States of amnesia.
Mm. We have another question from Cheryl, and
Mhm.
she asks, thank you for introducing me to this mesmerizing introduction to events that transpired whilst I was a toddler. I found it heartbreaking that the friendship between these two men was subject to the powerful external forces that tore it apart, as this was my first prima facie opportunity to hear Malcolm X speak, and it was powerful. So that's her statement. Another question from Manny says, did they split because of their differences in racial ideologies or religious ideologies, or both?
I think it is a combination there, obviously, and a little bit more too, because you can't ignore the kind of personal, we always have the spiritual, the individual, the personal, we have the ideological, the political, all these different vectors, these factors that kind of impact on an individual or a circumstance and a situation. And obviously, I think they had more in common than differences. And you can start in the very beginning of their lives, because here's someone who was born with the name of Cassius
Mhm.
Marcellus Clay Jr., and another one was born with Malcolm Little. So over the time, over the course of their lives, as their politics and their religion, the ideologies changed, their names changed too. Each of them had names at the end of their lives that they were not born with. From Malcolm Little to Malcolm X to El Hajj Malik al Shabazz, from from looking at Muhammad, coming from Cassius, I mean, named after, some people who was less than noble and less than admirable, and a name he could quickly just dismiss. So the whole slave name thing plays out in both their lives as they try to resurrect, bring themselves, reinvent themselves in a sense. It's an adjustment, it's a transformation that occurs there, and it's been replicated again and again, with African Americans in this country trying to disavow that whole situation, that whole connection with the slave experience, because it cannot be an experience that absolutely obviate, what we have struggled for in this country. We understand the nature of that oppression, that kind of absolute, and it continues in so many different ways as we look at voter suppression, as we look at some of the decisions that's recently come
Mhm.
down with the Kim Potter and with the Dante Wright, with the situation in down in Georgia with not Arbery, to say nothing of the decision now being deliberated about George Floyd and whether his civil rights were violated.
Mhm.
So Malcolm had to go through a lot of that struggle, but he was determined to share the kind of information he had with the whole world. That's what that travel was all about. One of
Mhm.
the things that we should not miss is that the most interesting year in his life is 1964, and a little bit of 1965. It still hasn't been properly, I think what this here particular documentary does is that begins to open up this aperture that we can get even deeper into it, because there's a lot more information to be said. It's almost like, hey, Marcus, give us part two.
Mhm. Mhm. So we have a question from Louise, who asks,
Mhm.
did Malcolm or Muhammad have any interactions with Martin Luther King?
I think to a certain degree, we can talk about Malcolm and Martin. Um, I think toward the end of his life, and many people have speculated on this, Sam, in terms of the trajectory of their lives, the convergence, so possibly of these two individuals coming together and how powerful that would be. And it just made them a bigger target for the enemies out there to take them out, because that would have been a formidable combination, a
mhm,
dauntless duo. And Malcolm, toward the end of his life, had begun to really push aside all of those negative things he was saying about the other parts of African American leadership, certainly the Big Six at that time, which he used to
mhm,
castigate all the time.
mhm,
But he stopped doing that. And toward the end of life, he began to recognize that that was counterproductive, that maybe we need to focus and accentuate the positives. Let's see how we can come together and in a mutual way struggle against, racism, white supremacy, the bigotry, Jim Crowism that existed in this country. An example of that is in the 19 when in 64, when he goes down to Selma and he meets in the film Selma that Ava DuVernay has done such a wonderful job on. You have, and even in the Malcolm X film that Spike Lee did, you have a situation where Malcolm is talking to Betty and letting her know, and of course Randy and Johnny, they get into it a little bit in the book too, and talking about how as Malcolm is saying to Betty, you tell Martin, who was in jail at that time, he couldn't meet with him, but he was telling Betty, you tell Martin, we got his back. We're with him all the way on this. They only met once. It's kind of a chance meeting that they had down in Washington, D.C., and down in one of the Capitol buildings or something like that. They were passing and they shook hands, and that photograph has been widely disseminated. But it was not a substantial meeting. I think they were on the verge of coming closer and closer together. I think when Malcolm had already reached a kind of a pinnacle, a plateau of political understanding and consciousness in world affairs. Martin was getting there too, because you check out one of the last speeches he gave, they always focus on I Have a Dream speech, but check out that one in 1967 that he delivered right here in New York City, over there at the church, at Riverside Church, where we talked about the militarism, where we talked
mhm,
about the war in Vietnam. So
mhm,
he was moving in a way in which the trajectory of his life was going to converge with Malcolm. They were coming together. The internationalism of both those individuals was absolutely profound.
mhm, mhm. Great. Um, we have another question. This goes back
Sure.
to your telling us about your request for files, the FBI surveillance files.
Hmm.
It asks, uh, why do you believe the FBI is so defensive slash fearful of sharing the documentation you've requested?
I think one of it has to do with the very reasons that they did it in the first place. So it's a continuing pattern
Hmm.
of disinformation, misinformation, and pulling the wool over our eyes and not understanding even some of the stuff that's going on right now, which
Hmm.
are more, I guess, will indicate that the more things change, the more they remain the same when it comes to the kind of inspection, surveillance, and particularly in this digital universe that we live in.
Hmm.
Just nearly everything, they have access to our whole lives, and if you're an activist out there, even more so, because then you present a certain kind of threat. And I think that's what was happening with Martin and Malcolm, is that in their growing popularity and their growing significance in terms of in politics, that you can begin to change things because the electorate, I mean, you can never underestimate the ignorance sometimes of the American public. But I think they were educators. They both were teachers, phenomenal teachers. And they were trying to tell the people of this country and the rest of the world what's going on.
Hmm.
That's something that the CIA and the FBI was trying to obfuscate, to kind of really cover and push down and push aside. No, you don't need to have that, because information is power. I mean, my mentor, Dr. John Henry Clarke, used to say all the time, get all the information you can, because that's a tool. That's a tool that you can use to fight against, oppression, to fight against ignorance, and begin to enlighten, your brothers and sisters. We have that responsibility. I tell my students, I hope a few of them join me today, Sam, in seeing this documentary, because that documentary that's like 5 or 6 lectures right there.
It is. It is. Or maybe 10 good research papers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. We have a couple of questions
Hmm.
that are by two different people. They're pretty much talking about the same thing, and that is the impact that this legacy has had on the kind of movements that are taking place today, and whether one of the questions kind of pose whether we will see these kind of movements again,
Mm.
and the other is sort of asking a little bit more about the impact of the Malcolm X and that era
Mm.
on today.
That's something what I try to convey in the classroom and stimulate some discussion as we do our research and reflect on the lives of Malcolm, Martin, Muhammad. Um, Whether we'll see, there's an old expression, you can't step in the same river twice.
Mm,
That's boom, boom, it's gone, and maybe we won't get it back like we had it before. And that may be a good thing too, because I think we're crying out for and begging for an analysis of what happened in the 60s. In the same way, we need to have a solid understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the 1930s. And then
mhm,
even going back to the Harlem Renaissance and the dawn of the 20th century that Du Bois talked about in Souls of a Black Folk. Those kind of things need to be pulled together so we can get a solid understanding of where we are. It's kind of the Sankofa notion that we can face forward, but we got to look back. But we understand that past is prologue. So we go back and we study that history. I think it's important. The movements out of the 60s, some elements of it happening right now. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter that has some kind of connection to the other BLM, the Black Liberation Movement. These BLMs got to come together. We find some
mhm,
kind of way to make that association so the younger people who, in bringing this elder on this program and have opportunity to talk to a lot of the young people out there, I think that's got to be a step in the right direction. That's a stepping
mhm,
stone as we march toward a better understanding and a more empowerment situation that we have as a Black people in this country. I'm enthusiastic, and I feel very excited about what's happening, particularly in my classroom, where I have students come in and they raise these same kind of questions we're hearing here.
mhm,
And so they can feel that they're not alone in their quest, that there's other young people out there and some older people too. We can't dismiss us
mhm.
octogenarians, we're still out there. And it's good to have that because we have to hook up the other we got to bring these generations together. And I think that was one of the miscarriages we had out of the 60s. They're kind of like, oh, you're over 30, so they dismiss you and say, come on,
Mhm,
So we can't dismiss anyone. We need every soldier because there's so many fronts we have to fight on. You
mhm,
got the political, economic, social, the psychological, to say nothing of the spiritual fronts. All these fronts, we need these soldiers, these individuals and younger people coming along. And they cannot be, we don't have them, diffused or confused
mhm,
about what's going on in the missions that they have. That's why we study these individuals, the
mhm.
Mohammeds and the Malcolms and the Martins. Sounds like the 3 M's right there, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Good
Um,
questions. Thank you.
they are. Here's one more from Kat. Where did any journalistic support for Malcolm come from? Were any of the Black newspapers or journalists on his side after his break with the nation?
Yeah, they would be. You have to understand, toward the end of his life, Malcolm was tending towards socialism. And he attended at least 3 or 4 important militant forums. This is Socialist Workers' Party forums in New York City. And a lot of folks felt that, oh, if a little bit longer, Malcolm would have been in the fold. He was moving forward more and more in a socialist direction from an ideological standpoint. And I think that would have been significant. That would have been a very interesting development because we had been cut off largely because of the divisive aspects and the kind of CIA, FBI, undercover infiltration, penetration of the OAU with Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Those were dangerous precedents that was going on at that time, and to undermine, the direction, the kind of push that the Malcolm has set in motion at that time. So I think one of the things we have to do at this point is that look at some of the newspapers and the digital universe that we live in to see to what extent they can be empowered to go back and do it over again that they didn't do before. Obviously, I've been with the Amsterdam News now for more than a generation. And I feel very good about the young journalists that are coming along these today who have have a different understanding, even a broader perspective, and a deeper concern about what's going on in the world of journalism, and they can kind of not make the same mistakes we made in the past. We didn't do enough on this, enough on that, because the Black press is absolutely necessary, more so than ever. And like people talk about doing away with Black History Month, we don't need the Black press anymore. That's ridiculous. We need it more than ever. And it's good to know that these young journalists are coming along, a few of them, they have a perspective, they have an interest, they have a desire and energy and enthusiasm, that kind of perspicacity that is so necessary for the fine journalism that's necessary as we move forward, because they have to look back, go into those files and dig them up, bring them up, study them, discuss them, find new ways to talk about some of the things that should have been done then if they were not done, but also accentuate the positive. Where was those interesting real freedom fighters who were like the soldiers in journalism that Stanley Nelson talks about in one of his documentaries? It's enough of them out there. We just need to do the work. We got a lot of work to do. And I think we have a generation of young journalists coming along. If we give them we could have to tell them, here's what we'd like to see you to do, as you work in your occupations. And a lot of this has to come from the kind of questions that the individuals are raising here. They can go ahead and put it to their journalists too, put it to their elected officials, put their feet to the fire, let them know what some of your interests and concerns are, whether it's going in the past, if you're talking about the moment, or if you talk about Afrofuturism.
Yeah. I think that one aspect of Malcolm's legacy is his work on Mohammed Speaks newspaper that later
Exactly.
became the Final Call. So it wasn't that he was a subject of journalists and journalism. He knew and understood the power of that communication, the media, and so forth. Couple of other things.
And Sam, on that
Yeah.
same point, is that, he had a column in the Amsterdam News. He had right there when Jimmy Hicks was the editor there, and we talk about an outstanding journalist that he was, and covering the whole Emmett Till trial down in Mississippi in 1955. It was good to see how they interpolated some of that into their discussion, because once you get into the lives of Muhammad and Malcolm, there's so many different what you call branches that you go, what you call tributaries that you can go off on to tie in African American history.
Exactly. Okay. And we have another question, and this might be the last one.
Good.
What do you believe needs to be further explored on Malcolm X's legacy and brought to the light?
Woo! The tapestry of that is broad. It is so much to be done. Some
Mhm,
of the things that I'm doing in the classroom right now, for example, last semester, I have my students, I usually average about 35, 36 students in the class. And last semester, I only do it in the spring. And so now I'm into my, what's the second, third week going in. We start at the end of January and take it all the way into May. So we got a period of time to look at different aspects of Malcolm's legacy, his life and legacy. And what I did last semester, I'm going to continue again this semester to some extent, and that is to go back and look at the trial. And we have some new developments now with the
mhm,
exoneration. Because we have some tragedies connected with some of that stuff too, and losing some very valuable individuals who could
mhm,
help us understand exactly what was happening in that time period. But I have my students, we kind of divvy up 4,000 pages, Sam. That represents the trial transcript that went down. And if you study that trial along with the autobiography that he wrote, you have a full complement, of Malcolm's life and legacy, what happened to him, particularly his assassination and some of the testimony that was delivered there by some of the witnesses, some good, some bad, some contradictory, what have you. So my students covered almost a good half of it, but there's still another half to be looked at. So I began to share each one of them take maybe 50 pages this time. Last semester, they had to do 100 pages. I think that was a little bit too much.
mm,
I think just take 50 pages and kind of just go into it, analyze it, dissect it, pull it apart, interrogate it, raise some questions with it, where you see some inconsistencies in terms of the contradictory statements coming from either the uh, the witness or what's going on with the judges and what's happening with the prosecution and the defense attorneys. So it's a very, very dynamic thing to look at the trial, just that transcript alone. That's one of the things that needs to be fully developed and done. So in the end, though, Sam, after I take 2 semesters, bring it all together, get the commentaries from our students, and then I'm going to propose to my department, the Black Studies program at City College. Okay, let's go to publication, y'all.
mhm,
As I've done before with students, with the
mhm,
whole Alex Haley thing, come out with Roots. And again, you connect Alex Haley up with the Malcolm
mhm,
X and the autobiography. Again, we talk about one of those branches that are one of the tributaries from moving off from Malcolm and Martin and Muhammad into different spheres. Even you
mhm,
talk about boxing with Muhammad Ali, not only Malcolm's, but what about Muhammad Ali in terms of the stimulation we can get from him and his life and legacy?
mhm,
As you look at the sports thing that's going on right now, the discriminatory aspects,
mhm,
what's happening with boxing, what's going on with the NFL, what's going on with women now, the old equal pay, the soccer thing, all those different
mhm.
kind of elements come into play. And it all derives from these two iconic individuals. They stimulate so much discussion and leave so many, I mean, we raise more questions than we got answers for, Sam.
Yes.
Mhm.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is Mr. Herb Boyd. And thank you so much, Herb,
Oh,
for
it's a pleasure.
analyzing and giving us information that we did not previously know or understand the context of the film Blood Brothers, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. I do have just one more announcement, and that is our next film in the From Slavery to Freedom film series will be on April 20th, and the film is called Stateless, which focuses on the mid 20th century issues of Haitians living in the Dominican Republic and all of the issues that they have there, the anti-Black hatred, um, the efforts of the Dominican government to neutralize Haitians, and it's going to give a historical background of what was once called Hispaniola a long time ago. But it's going to give us a background of this relationship between Haitians and Dominicans. So that is on April 20th, same time. Uh, look for the posting on the Heinz History Center website, and I hope you'll be able to join us. But again, I would like to thank Mr. Herb Boyd again for joining us and being such a major part of this evening's program. Thank you, be well, and be
Thank you,
safe.
Sam. Okay. I'll see you in April.
Okay, great.